Scott Freehafer, as Dr. Malacco said, and I'm glad to be here. This is going to be a tough audience. I've got members of the Church of God, I've got Pastor Reist, and I'm a business faculty who's going to be talking about the Apostle Paul. So this is going to be interesting. As you're relating about social media, this will also end up on YouTube. So if people want to take a look at it later, if it's worthwhile for you, feel free. You'll note that there are some places where you can take notes, and I brought some pens if people need some. Pass them around. We need to start by going back in time. If you're familiar with the book of Acts, Paul had been a persecutor of the church. And he had an experience with Jesus, and his life was changed. We pick up the story in Acts 27 as Luke recounts what's happening. Yeah, we're going to turn the lights off. And where is
for listening to me today and becoming except for these chains.
The king arose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. They left the room. And while talking with one another, they said,
"This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment."
Agrippa said to Festus,
"This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar."
When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Andromatia, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia.
and we put out to sea.
Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us.
The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us.
When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board.
We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them,
"Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also."
But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from this fall that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands.
When
When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said,
Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So, keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as He told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the waves, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers,
Unless those men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved.
So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat.
For the last 14 days,
He said,
you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now, I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head.
After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. But daylight came, and they did not recognize the land. They saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get their own planks or own pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness.
All right. We made it safe. Now, what does that have to do with perseverance and courage? and leadership. I'm here to make a confession. I'm not the most courageous person because I've been blessed not to have to live a courageous life. I've made some tough decisions over time, but most of them have actually been pretty easy. As far as perseverance, I made the choice to leave a good job and go back to school. I've been married for 21 years. Maybe that's courage. Maybe that's perseverance. I got engaged a month after my wife and I met. Maybe that's courage or crazy, but crazy? Okay. But as we look at the things happening these days, where I see true courage and true perseverance, we see on the news. Those in Japan affected by the earthquake and the tsunami, those in Chile affected by the earthquake, the miners who were trapped. Let's see, what other earthquakes and things have we forgotten? Haiti, yeah. There is a place where people have to act with courage and perseverance. So what am I here to tell you? Well, I want to go back to the story and take a look at some principles of courage and perseverance and leadership that I think are quite instructive for us. And I forgot my flipper over here. Paul's voyage to Rome. If I was Paul, I wouldn't really want to take that voyage, because his voyage to Rome, he could have been free, but his voyage to Rome was to appear before Caesar. It was his right as a Roman citizen. Why did he want to appear? Because he wanted to tell Caesar why he was preaching the gospel of Christ. But if it were me, and I could have been free, I might have made that choice just to accept my freedom and go on. Paul was not only a prisoner, but he was also being transported to Rome for the trial of his life, one which he would likely lose. And the accounts suggest that his life did end in Rome. And advance. Okay, we go this way. Okay, here's where he starts, Jerusalem. It's late in the season for sailing. And he goes up here, trying to stay close to shore to take advantage of not having the winds. But it was a windy time. It was a bad time. And he had told them that this is a bad time. We know from the Christian scriptures that Paul was a shipwreck victim several times. 3, at least. And he knew that they were sailing at the wrong time. So that became a worry. The cast of characters. We have Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment, responsible for Paul with his life. If Paul escaped, he dies. Not Paul. Julius dies. The ship's owner. This was a transport and grain ship. He had a lot to lose, and in the end, he did lose because he listened to the wisdom of the crowd. The captain of the ship was responsible for the ship, the cargo, and its passengers. The crew, the workers responsible for the operation of the ship, Aristarchus and Luke, friends and co-workers of Paul. Luke was also the physician, later wrote Luke and Acts. And what's important about that? Luke is known as a man of science. It's a very precise writing that he does. And John MacArthur says that this is probably one of the best accounts of ancient seafaring because it is so precise. Paul and the other prisoners were men without status. Now, I'm guessing that Paul actually had his hands bound or was in chains somehow. They may have taken a few liberties with the video, but they were not men of status. Who was in a leadership position? It certainly wasn't Paul. He was a prisoner. In fact, he had just about the lowest position on the ship, if not the lowest. The centurion was a leader of men. The ship's owner was a leader, or at least an owner. The ship's captain was a leader. Paul was a prisoner on this ship. But was he a leader? The answer is yes. Does leadership require position? That's the question we're here to consider. A prisoner takes command. As a prisoner on the ship, Paul began with no position or influence. But by the end of the voyage, everyone was listening to him and obeying his commands. Now, on your sheet, I ask you some questions. Are you on a leadership journey? I don't care how old you are. Are you on a leadership journey? I don't think it has to do with position. I don't think it has to do with gender. I don't think it has to do with age. Paul was the lowest of the low, and he was on a leadership journey. Are you in a position of power or authority? Is that required for leadership? I don't think it is. It helps, but it can also corrupt leadership. Kind of like salt. Salt's really good, unless you have too much of it, or it gets into the steel in your car. Will you be on a leadership journey in the future? This is particularly for the college students, but it applies to everyone here. Will you be in a position of power or authority? And if so, please listen to the words that I'm going to talk about, because this passage probably speaks more about leadership, courage, and perseverance than any one passage I've ever read. How did this happen that Paul took command, and what can we learn from it? How can we use these principles to improve our leadership abilities? Number one, he built trust. Julius allowed Paul special privileges, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go with his friends and receive care. Who was Julius? The centurion who was responsible for Paul with his own life. Paul must have been pretty straight up with Julius and established some rapport and some trust. Julius trusted Paul to come back, and he did, reinforcing that the trust that Julius had in Paul was correct. And I ask some questions here. What do you do to build trust in your organizations, with your superiors and with your subordinates? What do you do? Number one, the fill in the blank. In order to be a real leader, you need to build trust with people. He took initiative. With no permission or position, Paul stepped up and said, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end in disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." You know, sometimes in life you have to deliver bad news. I'm sorry, it's stage 4 cancer. There's not much we can do. We got that sentence from my sister-in-law about 10 years ago. She was 39 years old when stage 4 cancer was detected. She lived with courage and perseverance. Do you step up and take initiative when the opportunity presents itself? That's a question of character as much as it is opportunity. Paul possessed good judgment. In his brief speech, he revealed wisdom and experience. He had been shipwrecked before. He was not a rookie at this. He had experience with shipwrecks and wasn't afraid to share his thoughts and experiences. Do you share what you know and learn from your experiences, or are you afraid of not being heard? Now, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I heard a story from my pastor that the last known human battles in the Colosseum were fought in a day that a monk was traveling on a journey. And the monk didn't know what was going on, but he heard applause and roars from the crowd. And he walked down the steps of the Colosseum and he saw what was happening, and he said, "In the name of God, stop what you're doing." Although it was in Greek. I'll leave that to Bill to do that in Greek. And he kept going down, and in the name of God, stop what you're doing. And he got down to the ground floor and he went out onto the Colosseum floor, and someone ran him through with a sword. And in his dying breath, he said, "In the name of God, stop what you're doing." And that was the last known time when humans battled in the Colosseum. That monk acted with courage and perseverance. It was a short-term perseverance, but it certainly was courage. I'm a junior faculty member here. I'm an assistant professor. I've been in higher education for 21 years, but I came in at the assistant professor rank. And I deal with a lot of people who are on higher levels than I am in terms of the rank process. And am I afraid of not being heard because of my title? No. I'm only afraid of not speaking if I have an opinion that matters. That's not arrogance. That's just important. If what you have to share matters, you need to share what matters. He spoke with authority and credibility. This was a bad storm. You know how in Ohio we have certain titles for storms? This is a blizzard. This is a northeaster. This was a named storm. Paul reminded that he had been right early and did so boldly and unashamedly. Now, it's one thing to say, "I told you so." But it did establish his credibility that he did speak the truth before. What did he have to lose? He was already on the ship to go, probably to die. What did he have to gain? Good question. Do you speak up and remind people of what you said when you were right? Or do you say nothing because you're afraid and don't want to be rejected? Rejection hurts. And sometimes it's easier to be silent than to be rejected. But the courage that it takes when you know you have something to share, when you speak the truth. We're told to speak the truth in love, but we're still told to speak the truth. He was optimistic and confident. Sure, it helps that he was visited by an angel of God. But Paul encouraged the men. According to the angel, all the men were protected because of Paul. I want to ride in the car with Paul when the snow is bad and there's ice. Paul would live to see Rome, and for that to happen, everybody needed to survive. Do you remain confident and optimistic in the midst of life's storms? Do we have the perseverance and the courage to remain optimistic? Or do you portray this confidence and optimism to others around you? Now, I believe in the power of positive, Dr. Malakas. But I also believe that we are slightly negatively wired. And I'll prove that. The phone rings at 2 in the morning. Is it good news or bad news? It's bad news. Who would call with good news at 2 in the morning? My son. But I think in the absence of positivity, we have this human tendency to go downward. And we need people in our lives to pump us up and help us think positive. I think there's a passage, think on these things. They weren't bad things that we were supposed to think on. And when you portray confidence, when I portray confidence, guess what? Everyone around us is lifted. They're more confident. He gave encouragement. He spoke of survival and rescue. Therefore, take heart. When others are down in the dumps, do you get down in the dumps with them and have a pity party? Remember Job and his friends? Job was down in the dumps and his friends were down in the dumps with him. Curse God and die. I don't want to hang around those people. Do you encourage them and help them look toward a brighter future? You know, I saw some video today of Diane Sawyer on ABC, where the people in Japan were standing patiently in line waiting for food and waiting for water. There was no riot. There was no panic. There was courtesy. One of my colleagues said, you know, I missed it. I didn't see anybody carrying off a big screen TV because of looting. There's been none. It's amazing. We could really learn some things about civility and courage and perseverance there. I think they're looking toward a brighter future, even in the midst of tragedy. They're recycling. In the video, they had recycling bins set up. You recycle because you're concerned about the future. He was honest. He spoke with them candidly about their problems. They would run aground. Sorry, ship owner. Sorry, ship captain. You didn't win on this one. Are you honest when things don't look good? Jim Collins, in the book Good to Great, notes that brutal honesty, which he calls the Stockdale paradox, is needed if we're going to be level 5 leaders. And in his hierarchy, level 5 leadership combines a passion for what we do with a humility for how we do it. And we have to be honest in that process. Honesty builds trust even when we don't like the news that we have to deliver. When my sister-in-law received the diagnosis that it was a bad form of cancer, it was infiltrating ductal adenocarcinoma stage 4. And the surgeon that did the surgery, he came to my wife and he came to my sister-in-law and said, I think we got it all. But I'm sure we didn't. And with this particular type of cancer, we're talking about 1.5 to 2 years at the maximum. He spoke the truth. He didn't pull punches. He gave her the news that she needed to live a great next 1.5 years. She lived a great 1.5 years, probably had more life in her in that year and a half than she did in about 40 years before the surgery. Honesty builds trust even when we don't like the news that we're delivering. Paul didn't drift from his beliefs. And this required action on the soldier's part. The crew was trying to abandon the ship. Now, I want you to think about it. If the crew is abandoning the ship, is it bad? The captain goes down with the ship. No, the crew is leaving. That's a bad sign. If you're on Carnival and the crew is leaving, you know you've got a problem. They were trying to abandon the ship when they were needed the most. But the soldiers created a retention plan. There's an HR term. They cut the ropes and let the skiff fall off from the ship. They were committed. You're committed when you cut the ropes. Okay, maybe I showed a little courage. I left a good position with Ashland University. In fact, some of my friends thought I was nuts. Is that a psychological term? Probably not. Okay, they thought I was stupid. I had a good job. I'd been there for 12 years. I had good relationships with people. But I had seen that my peers would go for their doctorates and get ABD, and that's it. And I didn't want to have ABD behind my name. I wanted to finish the journey. So I left. I cut my ropes. Now that does two things. It motivates you. And when you cut your ropes and you did it with a spouse and a son, that motivates you. My wife was going to kill me if I didn't finish my doctorate. I don't think literally, but she would have been not so happy with me if I didn't finish. Sometimes we need to have a cut the ropes moment in our lives where we are committed. It's kind of like the chicken and the pig having a conversation about bacon and eggs. Where's the commitment? The chicken donates, the pig has to be committed. Are there times when you need to cut the ropes? Times like these test and refine us as leaders. Or do you compromise? Or do you hold course? It's often easy to compromise. It's hard sometimes to hold course. I'm reminded that Stephen Covey in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People says compromise is lose-lose in disguise. How many of you are married? How many of you have ever compromised on something that's important in your marriage? And it really became lose-lose because neither of you got what you wanted? Sometimes that happens. I know in my life when I've compromised, I run the risk of actually losing and resenting the compromise agreement. Covey says it's better to push and communicate and communicate and communicate to get to win-win. Now, I'm not saying all marriage is compromise. He stayed focused on the objectives, not the obstacles, and he helped fulfill practical needs. Food was an obstacle. They hadn't eaten in how many days? 14 days. I mean, talk about a diet. And you think about it, the food on the ship was probably spoiled or waterlogged with sea water, but there was apparently a little food that they could eat. Paul encouraged them to eat. He gave them hope for a future. You eat because there's something coming. Do you ever focus on the wrong needs? Sometimes it's hard to focus on the right needs that a person has, and easier to focus on the wrong ones. Do you know what your people's unmet needs are? Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as a psychological theory, he says unmet needs can motivate people. You're hungry, can you be self-actualized? Kind of hard in his theory. But do you know what people's unmet needs are? If you do, then you're in a position to help meet them. Paul knew what they were. He led by example and modeled the right actions and attitudes. He took bread, he broke it, I assume he broke it. He gave thanks and began to eat in front of the men. 276 people in all were on the ship. After they had eaten, they lightened the ship and threw the wheat into the sea. Now that requires some commitment on the part of the ship's owner. That's his cargo. But sometimes it requires commitment and courage to do so. Do you set the right example and realize that people are watching you to see how you weather life's storms? It's amazing to see how some people weather life's storms and emerge hopeful and victorious. We just buried a 23-year-old man from our church. His name is Jonathan Pound. He's our senior pastor's youngest son. He had cancer, found it about a year and a half ago. He lived a courageous life during that battle with cancer. And he talked to our church. And at one point he said, I do not want to miss this opportunity that God has given to me to have cancer. I don't want to waste it. And he lived a life of perseverance and courage, as did his family. You know, we had to put chairs out into the narthex at our church because there were so many people who had been watching his life and his journey that our church could not hold the crowd that came, not for the funeral service, but for the worship and memorial service of a life well lived. Cut short, but well lived. As leaders, and I don't care about your position, I don't care whether you're retired, I don't care whether you're working, I don't care if you're in college, whatever your position in life, you are leaders of someone. I'm going to take a guess here that you might have a grandchild. Do you have grandchildren? You're a leader for those grandchildren. They look up to you. And sometimes the words you need to share may not be what they want to hear, but it's what they need to hear. You're a leader. He ultimately succeeded. In doing so, Paul, the prisoner, ended up taking command and giving orders to those who were over him, positionally. And they listened and they obeyed. And their lives were spared. Even if you are not in a position of leadership in your organization, whatever organization you're a part of, that doesn't mean that you're not capable of leading and influencing others. So, what do? As leaders, do you build trust? Do you take initiative? Possess good judgment? Speak with authority and credibility? Express optimism and confidence? Give encouragement. I think people are so thirsty for encouragement and a positive word. Act with honesty and integrity. Know and stick to your mission. Paul knew his mission, and he stuck to it, regardless of the cost. Do you stay focused? Do you serve and fulfill people's practical needs? Do those who were impacted by the earthquake and tsunami need cable service? No, they need food, clothing, water, shelter. Back to the basics. That's where we can serve practical needs. Do we model the right actions and attitudes? Do we know our people? Do we lead by example? If so, if we can do these things, then I think we're in a position where we can lead with courage and perseverance. Now, I'd like you to imagine something. A world where people express these ideals and lived them. Would the world be different than the world we experience today? You know, I've gotten to the point where I don't like to watch the news. I wish they'd start with the weather and then the sports and then get to the other stuff, because there's so much bad news out there that if we focus on it, we become depressed if we let it. But Paul didn't focus on that. He focused on the positive. He was gonna get to see Caesar. Blows my mind that he was excited and wanted to make that journey. Did Caesar listen? Apparently not. But eventually, another Caesar did. And the Roman Empire became Christian. So, let's wrap it up. It's about 10 till. This is your leadership journey. Will you lead with courage and perseverance? That's a rhetorical question. But I'm here to tell you that every one of us is on a leadership journey. We influence others with our lives and our actions. If we dwell on the negative, guess what we're going to be? We're going to be negative. I love Winnie the Pooh. Eeyore is one of my favorite characters, but I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time around him, because you got old Eeyore. It could be 70 degrees and sunshine. We might even hit 60-something later this week. Eeyore would be going there, and Tigger would come up to him and say, Eeyore, isn't it great? Isn't the weather fantastic? And Eeyore would go, oh, suppose so, but I'll probably get a sunburn. Now, on the other hand, I'm not sure I could live with Tigger all day either, but you need that balance. Am I a person of courage? Of perseverance? Well, if you look at the statistics of people's number one fear, remember the show Fear Factor? I think they could have gotten everybody to drop out if they'd have said, okay, what you have to do is speak in front of an audience for 15 minutes. I've gotten over that fear. And I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and hope I had something to share that could add some meaning to your lives. So, thank you.